Have you ever watched someone so powerful hurt an innocent person, then smile as if nothing had happened? The kind of smile that says, nobody can touch me. Well, today's story is about a man who believed money made him untouchable. He was wrong. What happened next destroyed everything he had spent decades building. And the most satisfying part? Nobody broke the law to make it happen. Before we begin, if you've ever wished that cruel people would finally face the consequences of their actions, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and stay with me until the end. Because this isn't just a revenge story, it's proof that patience, intelligence, and justice can be far more devastating than anger. My name is Nathan Cole. For the past 8 years, I've served as a federal judge in Georgia. My career has been built on one principle: the law doesn't care how rich you are. Every morning starts the same way. Black coffee, a quiet office, stacks of case files, no sugar, no distractions. People often imagine judges living dramatic lives filled with shouting attorneys and dramatic courtroom speeches. Reality is much quieter. Most days are paperwork, legal arguments, and endless decisions that shape lives long after everyone leaves the courtroom. I've always believed emotions have no place behind the bench. Justice demands a calm mind. That belief guided every decision I'd ever made, until one Wednesday afternoon changed everything. The person who changed my life wasn't a criminal. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't even someone who enjoyed attention. Her name was Emily Cole, my wife. Emily had worked as a labor and delivery nurse for 12 years. If you've ever met someone who naturally makes other people feel safe, you already know her. She held terrified mothers through impossible births. She comforted fathers who looked seconds away from collapsing. She skipped lunch more times than I could count because another patient needed her first. She never complained. She simply smiled, tied her hair back, and kept helping people. There was another reason that autumn felt different. Emily was 7 months pregnant with our first child. Every evening we'd sit together in the nursery we'd spent months preparing. Soft green walls. A white crib beside the window. Tiny baby clothes folded with impossible precision. Sometimes she'd place my hand on her stomach, laughing whenever our son kicked. "He's already stubborn," she'd whisper. "I wonder where he gets that." "I've got a few guesses," I'd answer, making her laugh even harder. Those little moments became my favorite part of every day. I didn't know they were about to be replaced by something I'd never forget. Wednesday, 2:43 p.m. My phone vibrated during a review of a complex financial fraud case involving one of the largest investment firms in the Southeast. Emily never called during work unless something was wrong. The second I saw her name, my stomach tightened. I answered immediately. "Emily?" Silence. Not complete silence. I could hear breathing. Uneven. Controlled, the kind of breathing people force themselves into after they've been trying very hard not to cry. "Nathan." Her voice barely rose above a whisper. "I need you to stay calm." Every instinct inside me screamed that something terrible had happened. I stood so quickly my chair rolled backward into the bookshelf. "Talk to me." There was another pause. Then 4 words that froze my blood. "A man hit me." My fingers tightened around the phone so hard they began to ache. "What?" I'm okay." "No." My voice had become strangely quiet. "The baby?" They checked him. Another shaky breath. "He's okay." Only then did I breathe again. But relief lasted less than a second. Because another emotion was already replacing it. Cold, heavy, dangerously calm. "What happened?" Emily swallowed. "I accidentally brushed a man's arm with my medication cart, and—" He turned around. Another silence and slapped me. The room around me disappeared. No papers, no office, no courthouse, just those 2 words. He slapped me. Not during a fight, not in self-defense, not by accident. He had looked at my pregnant wife and decided she deserved to be hit. I closed my eyes. "Nathan, I'm here." He just walked away. Did anyone stop him? No. Why? I think everyone was too shocked. Then she said something that would stay with me forever. He smiled. That single sentence changed everything. Because people who smile after hurting someone rarely stop on their own. And I had no idea that the man responsible was already sitting at the center of one of the biggest federal cases on my docket. I would learn his name within the hour. And once I did, his countdown began. For the next 20 minutes, I drove to Savannah Memorial Hospital, with one hand gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had turned white. Normally, I obeyed every speed limit. That afternoon, every red light felt like a personal insult. The only thing keeping me calm was Emily's final sentence. "The baby is okay." I repeated those 4 words in my head like a prayer. By the time I reached the hospital, detectives had already arrived. Hospital administrators stood in anxious little groups, whispering to one another while nurses hurried through the halls pretending everything was normal. It wasn't. Nothing about that afternoon was normal. Emily was sitting in a private examination room. The moment I walked in, she forced a smile. It was the kind of smile people wear for someone else's sake. The left side of her face was slightly swollen. A faint outline of fingers had already begun to darken her cheek. My chest tightened. She stood and wrapped her arms around me. "I'm okay," she whispered. I held her carefully, terrified of hurting her or our unborn son. "You shouldn't have to say that," I answered quietly. She leaned back and looked into my eyes. "I know." For several seconds, neither of us spoke. The silence hurt more than words ever could. Finally, I brushed a strand of hair away from her face. "Tell me everything." Emily took a slow breath. It happened so fast. She explained that she had been delivering medication to patients on the 4th floor. The hallway wasn't crowded. Just a few nurses, an elderly patient, 2 visitors. She had carefully pushed her medication cart around the corner when a man wearing an expensive charcoal suit came storming toward her. He wasn't watching where he was going, she said. I moved as much as I could. The cart barely touched his sleeve. He stopped. She swallowed, looked at me like I'd insulted him, then she lifted her own hand and slapped me. I felt my heartbeat pounding inside my ears. "Did he say anything?" Emily nodded. He looked straight at me and said, her voice became almost emotionless, "People like you should learn to stay out of my way." Those words landed harder than the slap itself, not because of the insult, because they revealed exactly who he believed himself to be, someone above everyone else, someone who believed kindness was weakness, someone who had spent decades confusing wealth with superiority. And then, he adjusted his cufflinks. She stared at the floor, smiled, and walked away. No apology, no hesitation, no guilt, only arrogance. Hospital security supervisor Marcus Reynolds knocked gently before entering. "Judge Cole?" I nodded. "We have the security footage." Emily squeezed my hand. "I don't think you should watch it. I have to." Marcus carried a tablet into the room. He hesitated before pressing play. The hallway appeared on screen. The timestamp read 1:18 p.m. Emily entered from the left, pushing the medication cart carefully. Seconds later, the man appeared. Tall, perfectly tailored suit, silver watch worth more than most people's annual salary. His posture radiated entitlement. Even through silent footage, arrogance seemed to surround him. The cart lightly brushed his jacket. He stopped, turned, without saying a word. His right arm swung across. Crack. Emily stumbled sideways into the wall. Several nurses gasped. One patient covered her mouth. The billionaire calmly straightened his jacket, smirked, then continued walking as though he'd merely brushed dust off his sleeve. The video lasted less than 15 seconds. It felt like an hour. Marcus quietly paused the screen. "I'm sorry you had to see that." I wasn't looking at him. I was staring at the frozen image of the man's face. There was no panic, no regret, only satisfaction. "What is his name?" I asked. Marcus glanced toward the hospital administrator. Neither answered immediately. Finally, the administrator sighed. "His name is Victor Langford." The name sounded familiar. Too familiar. Then it hit me. Victor Langford, founder of Langford Capital, billionaire investor, media celebrity, one of the richest men in Georgia. And my eyes widened. Impossible, no. Not possible. I remembered the thick stack of legal files sitting on my desk that morning. The federal securities fraud investigation I'd been reviewing for nearly 4 months. The lead defendant was Victor Langford, the very man who had just assaulted my pregnant wife. Fate hadn't simply crossed our paths. It had collided them. Emily looked at me with concern. "Nathan?" I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I stared once more at Victor's frozen smile on the tablet. He thought this would disappear. He thought money would erase another victim. He had absolutely no idea that he had just handed destiny the final piece it needed. And for the first time in my career, justice had become deeply personal. There are two kinds of revenge. The first is driven by rage. The second is driven by patience. One burns fast, the other destroys everything. As I drove home that evening with Emily asleep in the passenger seat, one thought refused to leave my mind. I could never be the man who abused his position. If I wanted justice, it had to be real. Not personal, not emotional, legal. That decision became the foundation of everything that followed. The next morning, I arrived at the courthouse before sunrise. The marble hallways were silent. My chambers smelled faintly of leather-bound books and fresh coffee. Normally that smell calmed me. Today, nothing could. I placed Victor Langford's case file on my desk. For 4 months, I'd studied every document. Thousands of pages. Financial statements, emails, corporate records, witness interviews. Federal investigators believed Langford Capital had manipulated healthcare company valuations, deceived investors, and secretly earned hundreds of millions while ordinary families lost their savings. It was already one of the strongest white-collar criminal cases I'd ever seen. Now, its defendant had assaulted my pregnant wife. I stared at the file for several minutes. Then I reached for the phone. "Kara?" My law clerk answered immediately. "Yes, Judge? I need the recusal paperwork." There was a pause. "The Langford case?" "Yes. Did something happen?" "I'll explain later." "Right away." Within 20 minutes the paperwork sat on my desk. I signed it without hesitation. My signature felt strangely heavy, because I knew exactly what it meant. From that moment forward, Victor Langford would never stand before me. Another judge would decide his future. Some people would call that letting him escape. They couldn't have been more wrong. At exactly 10:17 that morning, the recusal became official. Every legal requirement had been followed, every ethical rule respected. My conscience remained clean. But Victor's problems were only beginning. Around lunchtime, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed a name I hadn't seen in weeks. Ethan Brooks, Special Agent, FBI Financial Crimes Division. We'd known each other since law school. Ethan, I heard about your wife. News travels fast. It does when a billionaire is involved. His voice changed. More serious. I also need to tell you something. I'm listening. We've been monitoring Victor Langford's legal team. I frowned. What do you mean? We've received credible information that someone connected to his organization has been investigating you. A cold silence settled over the room. What kind of investigating? They've pulled property records. My mortgage? Yes. My investments? Yes. My wife's employment? Yes. I slowly leaned back in my chair. They're trying to find leverage. Ethan didn't answer immediately. Finally, we believe they intended to discover whether you had a price. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then I laughed. Not because anything was funny. Because it was unbelievable. Victor Langford hadn't merely assaulted my wife. He'd apparently assumed every federal judge had a number, a price tag, a weakness. He truly believed justice could be purchased, like another luxury penthouse. "Nathan, I'm here. What are you thinking?" I looked out my office window. The American flag waved gently above the courthouse. "I'm thinking," I said quietly, "that arrogant men often create their own evidence." That afternoon, Ethan arrived carrying 2 thick folders. He placed them carefully across my desk. "What you're about to read isn't public yet." Inside were transcripts, financial records, phone logs, emails obtained through warrants. One message caught my attention immediately. It had been sent by Victor's personal attorney. "Find out everything about Judge Nathan Cole. Debt, family, habits, weaknesses, everyone has a number." My jaw tightened. There it was. In black and white. Not speculation. Proof. Victor hadn't planned to win honestly. He planned to buy justice. And if that failed, who knew what came next? Ethan closed the folder. "The Attorney General's office is considering obstruction charges. On top of securities fraud?" He nodded. "If we prove attempted judicial interference, his sentence could nearly double." For the first time since the hospital, I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction. Hope. Because Victor Langford had spent his life believing rules existed for everyone else. Now, those same rules were quietly tightening around him. Not because I bent them, because he broke them. and he still had absolutely no idea. While he was busy hiring expensive lawyers, the people closest to him were already beginning to talk. Victor Langford had spent 30 years believing he controlled every story written about him. Money bought silence. Power bought loyalty. Fear bought obedience. But there was one thing even billions of dollars couldn't buy once it escaped into the world: the truth. And the truth was about to spread faster than anyone in his public relations department could stop it. 3 days after I officially recused myself from the case, I was eating breakfast with Emily. The swelling on her cheek had faded into a faint yellow bruise. Physically, she was healing. Emotionally, that was another story. She caught herself flinching whenever someone walked too close behind her. Every time I noticed it, something twisted inside my chest. No one should have to live with that kind of fear because of another person's arrogance. Our morning was interrupted by my phone vibrating across the table. It was Ethan. "Nathan. Morning. You should turn on the television." His voice carried an excitement I rarely heard. "What's happened?" "The hospital footage." "What about it?" "It's public." I looked toward the living room and grabbed the remote. Every major news channel carried the same headline: "Billionaire caught on camera assaulting pregnant nurse." Then the footage played. Again, and again, and again. The entire country watched Victor Langford strike a pregnant woman who had done nothing more than accidentally brush his sleeve with a medication cart. No dramatic music, no editing, just 15 seconds of pure arrogance. He stopped, turned, raised his hand, slapped her, smirked, walked away. Emily quietly reached for my hand. "I didn't think seeing it again would hurt." "It does?" She nodded. "But..." She squeezed my fingers. "Now everyone sees what really happened." By noon, social media had exploded. Millions of people had watched the video. Doctors, nurses, veterans, teachers, parents, complete strangers. The reactions were nearly unanimous. People weren't just angry, they were disgusted. News reporters uncovered interviews with former employees. One executive described Victor as the most intimidating man I'd ever worked for. Another admitted she had resigned after years of verbal abuse. A retired assistant broke into tears during an interview. He treated people like furniture. Another former employee said something that stayed with me. "The slap didn't surprise me. The cameras did." Those 6 words spoke volumes. They suggested this wasn't one terrible moment. It was simply the first time the world had seen the real Victor Langford. Inside Langford Capital, panic spread like wildfire. Shareholders demanded emergency meetings. Board members feared criminal exposure. Major investors began pulling hundreds of millions of dollars from company funds. Television helicopters hovered outside corporate headquarters. Every hour brought another resignation, another canceled contract, another corporation announcing they were ending partnerships. Victor had spent decades building an empire. Now, it was collapsing one brick at a time. Late that afternoon, Ethan walked into my chambers carrying another folder. He looked exhausted. "You were right." "About what?" "Arrogant men create their own evidence." He placed the folder on my desk. "We've got 3 new cooperating witnesses." "Employees?" He smiled. "Former executives." I opened the file. Signed statements, emails, financial spreadsheets, internal messages. One executive had secretly saved years of communications. Another had recorded meetings. A third had voluntarily turned over encrypted financial records. The government's case had gone from strong to devastating. Ethan leaned forward. "And there's more." I looked up. "We executed search warrants yesterday." "What did you find?" He slid a printed email across the desk. The subject line read, "Judge Cole." I scanned the first paragraph, then the second. By the third, I slowly leaned back in my chair. Victor's legal advisors hadn't merely researched me. They had discussed possible approaches, potential intermediaries, financial pressure, personal leverage. One sentence stood out above everything else. "Every man has a weakness. We simply haven't found Judge Cole's yet." I closed the folder. "They still don't understand." "What?" "They're looking for a weakness." Ethan smiled knowingly. "But they found a man who refuses to bend." I looked toward the courthouse window. Outside, ordinary people walked the sidewalks, completely unaware that one of the most powerful businessmen in America was watching his world fall apart. Not because someone destroyed him, because his own choices had finally caught up with him. And the biggest blow hadn't even landed yet. The grand jury was still listening. The prosecution was still building. And somewhere across the city, Victor Langford still believed his wealth would save him. He was about to learn the most expensive lesson of his entire life. For the first time in his adult life, Victor Langford couldn't make a phone call that fixed the problem. He couldn't threaten it. He couldn't buy it. He couldn't intimidate it. The federal government had finished building its case. And now, it was time for 12 ordinary citizens to decide the fate of one extraordinary ego. The trial began on a cold Monday morning in March. I wasn't there. I couldn't be. Even though I had legally recused myself months earlier, I refused to set foot inside that courtroom. Justice had to remain beyond question. Instead, I followed the proceedings the same way every citizen could, through public records, news reports, and conversations about matters already in the public record. Emily watched the opening statements on television from our living room. Our son, Ethan Cole, had been born just 3 weeks earlier. 7 pounds, 3 ounces. Healthy, loud, perfect. Watching Emily hold our son while the man who had struck her finally answered for his actions reminded me why this battle had always been bigger than revenge. It was about consequences. Judge Rebecca Lawson, a woman respected throughout the federal judiciary for her fairness and unwavering discipline, presided over the trial. She had a reputation for treating billionaires and janitors exactly the same. Victor's attorneys quickly discovered that reputation was well-deserved. No special treatment, no delays, no courtroom theatrics. Only facts, only evidence, only law. The prosecution opened with financial records. Thousands of pages, bank transfers, corporate emails, secret accounting files. Government experts carefully explained how Langford Capital had artificially inflated the value of healthcare companies before quietly selling their shares to unsuspecting investors. The documentary evidence mirrored the long-running federal fraud investigation described in the original case materials. Every chart made the scheme easier to understand. Every witness filled another missing piece. Every hour made Victor look less like a respected businessman and more like the architect of an enormous fraud. Then came the witnesses. Former executives, senior accountants, investment analysts. One after another, they testified. Some admitted they had once admired Victor. Others confessed they had feared him. Nearly all of them repeated the same theme. He believed he was untouchable. One witness described meetings where employees were publicly humiliated for asking ethical questions. Another testified that anyone who questioned questionable financial practices was immediately pushed out of the company. The jury listened carefully. Some jurors took notes. Others simply stared at Victor. His confident smile was beginning to disappear. Then came the evidence no public relations team could explain away. The government's attorneys introduced communications suggesting attempts to gather personal information about the sitting federal judge assigned to the case before recusal material that supported the obstruction-related allegations discussed during the investigation. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Jurors leaned forward. Victor's lawyers objected repeatedly. Judge Lawson overruled each objection that lacked legal merit. The prosecution never raised its voice. It didn't have to. The documents spoke for themselves. Outside the courthouse, television cameras waited every morning. Reporters broadcast live updates. Financial networks questioned whether Langford Capital could survive. Investors fled. Business partners disappeared. Board members resigned. The empire Victor had spent decades building wasn't being attacked. It was collapsing under the weight of its own foundation. One evening, after another exhausting day of testimony, Emily found me standing alone in Ethan's nursery. Our son was asleep. Peacefully unaware of the storm surrounding our family, she wrapped an arm around mine. "You've been quiet. I've been thinking." "About Victor?" I nodded. I expected to feel satisfaction. And I don't. She looked at me with quiet understanding. "What do you feel?" I watched our son breathe. "Relief," Emily smiled softly. "Because justice isn't supposed to feel exciting. No, it's supposed to feel necessary." She kissed my cheek. For months I wanted him to suffer the way I suffered. She looked toward Ethan, but watching our son sleep, she paused. "I don't need revenge anymore. I just need him held accountable." Those words stayed with me, because they captured the difference between hatred and justice. After 6 weeks of testimony, The attorneys delivered their closing arguments. The prosecution asked the jury to follow the evidence. The defense asked for doubt. Then 12 strangers disappeared behind closed doors. The waiting began. Victor still believed there was a chance. He sat perfectly still, hands folded, jaw clenched, trying desperately to project confidence. But confidence built on arrogance has one fatal weakness. Eventually, reality arrives. And when those courtroom doors finally opened again, Victor Langford's entire future would be decided in less than 5 minutes. The jury was gone for 2 days, 48 hours. To most people that might not sound like much, but when your future depends on 12 strangers, every minute feels like an eternity. Victor Langford entered the courtroom on the morning of the verdict wearing the same expression he'd worn for most of his adult life. Calm, confident, certain, he walked past reporters without answering a single question. His attorneys surrounded him like a wall, whispering last-minute reassurances. "Whatever happens," one of them quietly said, "we still have options." Victor gave a small nod. He still believed this was just another business problem, another obstacle money could solve. He had no idea his life was about to change forever. I wasn't inside the courtroom. Instead, I was sitting on the back porch of our home with Emily and our newborn son, Ethan. The spring air was warm. Birds chirped in the oak trees. Our son slept peacefully in Emily's arms. It was strangely quiet. Neither of us spoke much. There wasn't anything left to say. We had already accepted that the verdict was beyond our control. For the first time since the day in the hospital, justice belonged entirely to the legal system. Exactly as it should. Then my phone rang. It was Ethan Brooks. I answered immediately. "They're back," he said. The jury had reached a verdict. Inside the courtroom every seat was filled. Reporters, federal agents, former employees, investors who had lost their life savings, families whose retirement funds had disappeared. Even people who had never met Victor Langford wanted to witness the moment. Because his case had become bigger than one billionaire. It had become a symbol. A reminder that power should never place someone above accountability. Judge Rebecca Lawson entered. The courtroom stood. Then, everyone sat. The foreperson rose slowly. Judge Lawson looked toward the jury. "Has the jury reached a unanimous verdict?" "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom became perfectly silent. On the first count, guilty. On the second, guilty. Then, another, and another. Every financial fraud charge, every conspiracy charge, every obstruction-related charge supported by the evidence presented during trial. The original source describes the jury convicting the defendant on all counts after extensive evidence and testimony. The word echoed through the courtroom. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Victor's confident expression disappeared. For the first time, he looked confused, as though reality itself had betrayed him. His attorneys immediately began whispering. Appeals, motions, technical arguments. Anything to regain control, but none of it mattered anymore. The jury had spoken. My phone remained against my ear. Ethan Brooks laughed softly. "He's finally figured it out." "What?" "He isn't the most powerful man in the room anymore." I closed my eyes. Months earlier, I'd imagined this moment would fill me with satisfaction. Instead, I felt something entirely different. Peace, because justice had never depended on my anger. It depended on evidence, and evidence had won. The consequences came quickly. Banks froze company assets. Major lenders demanded immediate repayment. Corporate partners terminated long-standing agreements. The board of Langford Capital held an emergency meeting that lasted nearly 11 hours. By sunrise the next morning, Victor Langford was no longer CEO of the company he had founded. Within weeks, the board voted to dissolve the firm as creditors and investors moved to recover what they could. The source describes the company's collapse following the convictions. Employees packed boxes. Corporate signs were removed. Trading accounts were closed. The empire that had taken 30 years to build collapsed in less than 3 months, not because anyone sought revenge outside the law, because truth has a way of surviving longer than lies. A few evenings later, Ethan Brooks came over for dinner. Emily had made her famous pot roast. Our son slept nearby, completely unaware that history had quietly unfolded around him. After dinner, Ethan leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said, "when you recused yourself from the case, I thought you were walking away." I smiled. "I wasn't walking away. You were protecting the process. Exactly. He raised his glass. Most people think revenge is about striking back. And? He smiled. This was something much better. I looked toward Ethan sleeping peacefully. No, this wasn't revenge. It was accountability. But sentencing was still weeks away, and Victor Langford had one final lesson left to learn. Because losing his company would prove to be the easiest part of his punishment. Some people believe revenge ends when the person who hurt you suffers. They're wrong. Real justice ends when the innocent no longer have to look over their shoulder. When fear is replaced by peace. When the guilty finally understand that consequences are real. That day arrived on a warm Friday morning in May. The federal courthouse was surrounded by reporters hours before sentencing began. Television vans lined the streets. Camera crews waited outside the entrance. People from every walk of life had gathered to witness the final chapter in Victor Langford's downfall. Former employees, retired investors, nurses from Savannah Memorial Hospital, even complete strangers who had followed the case since the security footage first appeared online. Everyone wanted to know one thing. Would one of the richest men in America finally face the same justice as everyone else? As before, I wasn't inside the courtroom. I had no business being there. I had removed myself from the case months earlier because that was what the law required. That recusal and the reason for it became part of the public record after the assault on my wife. Instead, I spent the morning at home. Emily was rocking Ethan in the nursery. Sunlight poured through the window onto the pale green walls we had painted together before our son's birth. For the first time in months, our house felt peaceful. No lawyers, no investigators, no phone calls every hour. Just family. Emily looked over at me. Are you nervous? I smiled. Not anymore. She nodded knowingly. We've already won. Not because Victor was going to prison. Because he no longer controlled our lives. Fear no longer lived in our home. Just after noon, my phone rang. It was Ethan Brooks. It's over. I stood slowly. What happened? His voice was calm. The judge sentenced Victor Langford to 26 years in federal prison. I closed my eyes. 26 years. The sentence reflected convictions for securities fraud and additional obstruction-related offenses, bringing his downfall to its legal conclusion. Not 26 months. Not probation. Not house arrest. 26 years. For a man who had spent decades believing consequences were reserved for other people. According to courtroom reporters, Victor stood motionless as the sentence was read. No smile. No confidence. No arrogance. Just disbelief. The same man who had once walked through a hospital corridor smiling after striking a pregnant nurse, now stood silent while U.S. Marshals prepared to place him in handcuffs. One decision. One moment of unchecked arrogance. It hadn't created all of his problems. It had simply exposed the man he had always been. The fraud, the manipulation, the attempts to influence justice, the abuse of power. None of it began in that hospital hallway. That hallway merely revealed it to the world. Within months, Langford Capital no longer existed. Its offices emptied. Its name disappeared from downtown buildings. Executives who had once competed for Victor's approval quietly searched for new jobs. Several associates faced professional investigations of their own after questions arose about their conduct during the case. The source notes ongoing disciplinary and legal scrutiny involving members of the defense team. The empire was gone, not because someone burned it down. Because its foundation had been built on deception, and foundations like that always collapse. A week after sentencing, Ethan Brooks joined us for dinner. Emily had cooked enough food for an army, insisting no one should leave hungry. After the meal, we sat on the back porch while Ethan slept peacefully inside. Ethan Brooks raised his glass. I owe you an apology. For what? I thought you were going to let anger decide your actions. I smiled. I wanted to. I know. But you didn't. I looked toward the nursery window. My son will someday ask me what I did when someone hurt his mother. Ethan nodded. What will you tell him? I didn't have to think. I'll tell him I followed the law. I'll tell him I refused to become the kind of man I was trying to stop. I'll tell him that justice matters most when it isn't personal. Emily reached for my hand. Her eyes filled with quiet pride. That's exactly what he'll need to hear. As the sun disappeared behind the trees, I realized something that had taken months to understand. Victor Langford never lost because I was powerful. He lost because he believed no one else was. He underestimated ordinary people. He underestimated honest investigators. He underestimated courageous witnesses. He underestimated a justice system that, while imperfect, still works when people refuse to compromise it. Most of all, he underestimated the consequences of raising his hand against someone who had done nothing to deserve it. The slap lasted less than a second. The consequences lasted the rest of his life. And that's the lesson I hope my son remembers. Power doesn't make you untouchable. Character does. If this story reminded you that true justice is worth waiting for, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments, what do you think was Victor Langford's biggest mistake slapping Emily? Believing money could buy justice, or thinking he would never face consequences? Until next time, stay safe, stand up for what's right, and remember, the strongest revenge is living long enough to watch justice do its job.